Ave Maria, welcome back to No Apologies. Today we continue with more proofs of Christ's claims to divinity, and we're on our second point, which is that Christ proved himself to be God through his wondrous works, and today we're going to look specifically at his resurrection. So Christ's resurrection from the dead by his own power is the crowning glory of his career. It wasn't just a miracle, it was a fulfillment of his own prophecy. Jesus tells his disciples in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 17, verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." And then later on in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20, verse 18 through 19, we read this, "And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, 'Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and deliver him to the Gentiles to be mocked and scourged and crucified, and he will be raised again on the third day.'" He was, in fact, so clear about the matter that even his enemies had recourse to Pontius Pilate after the crucifixion. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 63, we read this, "Next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, 'Sir, we remember how this impostor said while he was still alive, "After 3 days I will rise again." Therefore order the sepulchre to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away, and tell the people he is risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first.'" Now regarding this miracle of his resurrection, two things we have to know beyond a shadow of a doubt. One, that Christ truly died, and then second, that he truly rose. If we can be sure of these two things, then we can be sure that Christ is God, because again, we have the divine approval stamped on this work, giving credit to our Lord's doctrine. And second, because in this miracle, he shows himself the master over life and death, and that of course belongs to God alone. So, to begin, that Christ truly died. All four evangelists testify that Christ died on the cross. St. Matthew relating that he yielded up his ghost, and the others using the expression that he gave up his ghost. St. Mark records the report made by the centurions to Pilate, confirming his death, in his Gospel, chapter 15, verse 44 through 45. "And Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph." The soldiers who came to break the legs of the two robbers who were crucified alongside of our Lord saw that he was dead, and as the Gospel of John relates, rather than breaking his legs, thrust his side with the spear, causing a wound that would be sufficient in itself to kill a man. When we consider what our Lord suffered before the crucifixion, his bloody agony, his maltreatment and exposure in prison, his still more bloody scourging and crowning of thorns, his more maltreatment and exposure, and then finally the dragging of the heavy cross to the place of execution, where we marvel at the fact that he didn't die along the way. And then came the actual crucifixion, when his feet and his hands were nailed to the cross, and those wounds remaining open by the weight of his body, hanging on the cross for some 3 hours, in an agony and a thirst unimaginable. And after he was taken down from the cross, as the Gospel of John relates, he was then buried according to Jewish custom, which was to anoint the body with about 100 pounds of aromatic spices, to wrap it up in linen cloths, and then it was placed in an almost airtight sepulchre that was hewn out of a rock. This kind of a burial would be enough to suffocate even a man of good health, let alone Christ, who had endured so much prior to his burial. So we can say, certainly beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Christ truly died. So then, that Christ truly rose from the dead. Well, the apostles bear testimony to that fact in many places written in the Acts of the Apostles. And they had nothing to gain by a deception, nor were they the kind of men who were willing to try to pull a deception off in front of the Jewish people or the angry Pharisees, from whom they had just fled in terror just a short time before. They knew full well that by preaching the resurrection of Christ, that they were placing themselves in imminent danger of persecution and of death. but they maintained and they persevered in their convictions in the resurrection of Christ, even unto that death. Christ was seen by many people after his resurrection: Mary Magdalene, the 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus, the apostles in the upper room when St. Thomas wasn't present, and then again when he was present, on the shore to St. Peter and St. John, and to the others who had joined them in their fishing. And St. Paul testifies in his first letter to the Corinthians that on one occasion he was seen by more than 500 people at one time. Christ proved to these people that he was an actual physical resurrection by eating the dried fish and the honey, by allowing them to touch his wounds, and even by cooking for them a breakfast after they had labored throughout the night. And finally, we would point out that even Christ's enemies couldn't deny his resurrection as a fact. But rather than being moved to an act of faith, they took counsel together, as related in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28. And they gave a sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. And so, in a last and futile effort, as St. Augustine would point out, that the Pharisees would have us trust in sleeping witnesses. So, we have overwhelming evidence that Christ truly did rise from the dead. And we can conclude then, from the fact of his actual death and of his actual resurrection, that Jesus Christ truly was God. His doctrine was approved by the Almighty, and he is indeed master over life and death. Thanks for joining me on No Apologies. Ave Maria.